Angron is perhaps the most hated of all the demigod sons of the Emperor, the Primarchs. Fans of Warhammer 40K overwhelmingly feel like Angron, the Red Angel, is pretty much a trash character. In fact, when polling viewers about Angron in preparation for this video, I repeatedly saw people saying the same thing. Angron is trash. Angron is the worst character in Warhammer 40K. And even Angron is the worst character in fiction. Well, most esteemed citizens of the Imperium of Man, I'm here on behalf of the Ordo Hereticus to clear some things up for you where the Red Angel is concerned. For there's a lot more to Angron than simply just angry, betrayed gladiator who turned to Khorne because he was basically already a berserker and it just seemed inevitable. Angron might not be the deepest character in the setting, but it cannot be denied that he is perhaps the most tragic, along with his brother Konrad Curze. And his tragedy is probably one of the worst tearjerkers in the history of the galaxy. In fact, many people who know little about Angron tend to project what they think and feel about the World Eater's Legion onto the Primarch. But Angron did not have much in common with his sons, did not like them, and barely tolerated them, making his contempt for them known constantly by making them decimate their brothers for failure. So comparisons between him and his Legion might not be the standard by which we should be measuring Angron's worth. So why is he not only not trash, but actually awesome? The answer to that is adversity. Nobody in the entire galaxy had to overcome as much sorrow, tragedy, and horror as Angron. Angron is the product of not only the worst the galaxy could throw at a person, but also of neglect that could possibly just be called deliberate abuse. It is no wonder that Angron then became so single-minded and focused on nothing but vengeance. But with this one Primarch in particular, we have a wrench in the works, messing everything about him up. A piece of technology to contend with that changes everything. The Butcher's Nails. The Butcher's Nails not only dig into Angron's brain and cause him immeasurable pain, but they actually have replaced large, necessary sections of his brain. The Emperor could not be bothered to heal his son, though. Or perhaps he found it more to his benefit that his strongest dog was rabid. Angron is the only Primarch who joined the Emperor unwillingly. He was basically kidnapped, his honor and loyalty destroyed in a moment as the Emperor snatched Angron away, teleporting the Primarch to safety while his army of gladiators met their end. It is then, from the very moment that the Red Angel and the Emperor were reunited, that Angron developed his hatred and disloyalty for his father. The treachery of not letting him meet his end beside his brothers, to send him off to fight for a cause that was not his own, was the worst possible betrayal in the eyes of Angron. And I actually agree. It is for reasons like this that Rabute Guilliman reminds us that his father is not infallible. So why would the Emperor keep Angron around and give him command of the 12th Legion of the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines known as the Warhounds initially and renamed by the Primarch the World Eaters? It was obvious that Angronius of Nuceria, Lord of the Red Sand, was absolutely unhinged. What use did the Emperor of Mankind have for his 12th son that he would tolerate Angron being so broken and removed from what he had been created to be? The Primarch power that manifested naturally before the High Riders of Nuceria fitted Angron with the Butcher's Nails was an ability to empathize, calm, and heal those around him. Angron was naturally a healer, the calm of the storm, the eye of the hurricane. But landing on Nuceria began to change him from his true nature immediately, which is its own tragedy, as the one Primarch who was about healing wound up so absolutely opposite of his original purpose. When the Chaos Gods flung the Primarchs through the warp and scattered them across the galaxy, they sent Angron to a civilized planet, full of uncivilized people. The first people to encounter the child Primarch were slavers who took the child into slavery and raised it into a gladiator and forced to fight, kill, and die for their profit. But when they found him, he was obviously like no other child they had ever met. The Primarch was surrounded by dozens of corpses, torn apart and brutalized by his bare hands. About 50 dead Eldar lay around him in heaps, blood staining the ground all around them in a red lake. The Eldar had foreseen what Angron would become, and sought to end him before he grew up to achieve his destiny as a demon Primarch of Khorne. So his childhood sucked, immediately enslaved by the High Riders of Nuceria as they nursed the child back to health from his time alone in the wilderness fighting the Eldar. Angron became the greatest gladiator that Nuceria had ever known. He earned his name when dumped into a pit with dozens of other gladiators, and as the pit filled with acid, they had to fight to the top of a ziggurat until only one stood on the uppermost tier, surviving the acid. This was the last time Angron shed a tear. This traumatized the guy further into submission, but at the same time it sowed the seeds of rebellion in him as his hatred for the tyranny he was living under began to boil over. This is why I find that I can identify with Angron. The people who want to criticize Angron are vastly underestimating how bad the Primarch had it. No family, no friends except his fellow gladiator slaves, who he often had to just kill so he didn't die himself. Angron was mostly on his own, except he did have a mentor, Onimaeus, an older gladiator. He had taken the Lord of the Red Sand under his wing and taught him the ways of Nuceria. But, being the tragedy it is, of course Angron's story doesn't allow him to have any kind of real connection or love for anyone for very long at all, as the High Riders had plans of their own for Angron. The Primarch and his mentor, Onimaeus, were forced to fight a pair of Ogryn who were fitted with the butcher's nails. When they triumphed, Angron was then told to fight his mentor, which he refused. Instead, he used the moment to dress down the High Riders, and he gave them a serious piece of his mind, calling them out as the dishonorable cowards and slavers they were. So, of course there were repercussions. And to punish Angron, the High Riders had him fitted with the butcher's nails, which was not exactly like it was for other people, because he didn't have the same basic physiognomy as regular folks, or even Space Marines. He's a Primarch, so his brain had to be altered to accept the nails. They cut out huge chunks of his brain, his limbic lobe and insular cortex. This was not something that he could really recover from, as the butcher's nails not only replaced those parts of his brain, but assumed the functions of those areas, however incompetently, and became essential to his survival, even though they were slowly killing him. The Emperor even lamented not having the capability of removing them without causing the agonizing death of Angron. But having been fitted with the nails, Angron was then forced to face Onimaeus in combat, and he cut down his mentor in a total blinding rage. The nails had overcome him, and the fury the agony of their presence instilled in him erased all reason from his shattered brain, until the blood of his mentor flowed, and he stood triumphant. It was then that Angron knew true sorrow, and the loss of his mentor and what the High Riders had done to him was too much, and he went into a total fury. Angron led a rebellion of his fellow gladiators, and though they were outnumbered several thousand to one, they decided it was better to die on their feet than to live on their knees. And for the first time, the Primarch of the 12th Legion saw his salvation from the servitude he had known his entire life. Death would be his escape, and he'd take as many of the bastards who had kept him down with him as he could before he went out in a blaze of glory. But that would never happen, as the Emperor, on his great crusade, had arrived at Nuceria to claim his son. Angron denied him, choosing to die instead with his gladiator army with his honor intact and his loyalty unquestioned. The Emperor agreed and left, but it was a ploy, as when he got back to his ship, he snatched Angron up, kidnapping him against his will, teleporting the Primarch away from Nuceria. Angron watched as his brother gladiators died, and his heart grew embittered toward the Emperor, even as he was reunited with his father. From that moment, Angron saw his father as a tyrant and a despot who denied him the honor of dying in battle alongside his army of gladiator slaves, and at the same time resented his father for not saving them, as he did have the power to do so. But Big E, being the all-around good dad he was, reminded his son that it was all about the greater cause of the Imperium, and that the tiny dictators of Nuceria, the High Riders, were nothing compared to the warlords that he would be quelling with his new legion. So yeah, the Emperor did not give Angron even a shred of sympathy. It is a wonder Angron did not turn to chaos right then and there. This is where Angron's tragedy just gets so much worse. So after centuries of fighting in the name of the Emperor, who he absolutely hated, leading Space Marine sons developed from his gene seed that he also absolutely hated, Angron had had enough of doing things the Emperor's way. He was deluded at this point that he was free-willed and not a slave anymore, not even knowing he was the Emperor's slave. Not a son, but a tool. Angron was unaware at that point that he was taken as a small child into bondage and would for the rest of eternity remain in servitude as the Emperor's rabid attack dog, as a rebellious traitor too furious to function properly and think straight, lacking all tact and subtlety, and finally, as a slave to darkness, a dark prince of Khorne, a demon Primarch. But in this time of Angron's ignorance, he doomed his legion to his own fate, and had all the World Eaters fitted with the butcher's nails. The Emperor found this distasteful and demanded the practice stop, which Angron absolutely ignored. But since the other legions were complaining about the brutality and mindless rage of the World Eaters, making it harder to conduct joint operations with them, the Emperor had to put his foot down. So he dispatched Leman Russ and the Space Wolves Legion to rein Angron in and set things straight, which went about as good as you'd think it would. The meeting ended up resulting in full-on conflict, and many Space Marines died on both sides. But Russ baited Angron into a trap, making the Red Angel believe he had Russ beaten, falling upon the Wolf King in a fury. But the rage was a blind rage, and Angron failed to notice that the Space Wolves of Russ's bodyguard had him surrounded. Russ considered it a win and thought that Angron should have learned his lesson, but being incapable of any sort of critical thinking, hell, even of rational thought at all due to the butcher's nails, Angron thought that he won, as more Space Wolves died than World Eaters. So Russ withdrew his troops and went back to Big E with his tail between his legs. He should have killed Angron, and he knew it, but he didn't want to have to kill his brother, which is understandable. So Big E dispatches Horus next to rein in Angron in the 12th Legion. Big mistake, as Horus had already fallen to chaos, and the heresy was about to kick off. So, naturally, Angron joined Horus, if for nothing else, just the fact that he could get revenge on the Emperor, and maybe, just maybe, be released from his agony and finally find death in battle. But even that was denied Angron, and by the time the heresy is over, he will have fought several more of his brothers and become a demon prince / demon Primarch of Khorne. Basically, he became a bloodthirster version of himself, the beast we see today. So Angron has a very sad, tragic backstory, but that is not what is wrong with him and how people perceive his character. It is the modern depiction, in my belief, that people have a problem with. The big red demon that can't really die and can only be banished for 8 weeks or whatever. The guy who only has one defining characteristic. The guy who is nothing but rage, constantly taking skulls for the Skull Throne and blood for the Blood God, and has literally no depth to him other than that. Yeah, it appears that they may have mishandled the character after the heresy. In current lore, he really is just a blind rage personified. He doesn't even care that it is the lion he is fighting on Wormwood during the Arcs of Omen storyline. He only cares that it is an enemy at first. Eventually he cares that it is taking way too long to dispatch the enemy, still doesn't care it is his brother, a literal Primarch. And take his skull because the butcher's nails are starting to cause him serious discomfort because he hasn't killed anyone in like 2 minutes. So all the depth they put into his sad tearjerker backstory from the Great Crusade and the Siege of Terra, they sort of pissed all over by turning him into a one-trick pony in Warhammer 40K. But when people say he is trash or he's the worst character in fiction, I find they either don't know his backstory or they're just trying to be edgy. Because there is actually a lot there when you look at the events of the Horus Heresy books, especially before he transitioned and ascended into demonhood. Honestly, the guy just wanted to be master of his own fate, and has always been, and now will forever be, a slave. He may lack the depth of characters like Magnus the Red and Fulgrim, may not have the tactical genius of Abaddon or Perturabo, but Angron has his thing, and he does it better and harder than anyone else in the entirety of Warhammer 40,000. Sure, Angron is a polarizing figure. You either love him or hate him, but the Lord of the Red Sand cares not from where the blood flows, only that it does. Blood for the Blood God, skulls for the Skull Throne.